To try and broadcast every day.
Excellent. Well, it certainly will help you sharpen your intellect, because not only, to look within, but also take on all these people from a pretty diverse background, I must say. So it's all good stuff. Okay, so we're joined by Tom Jump, T Jump. He is going gangbusters on YouTube. He's got a huge station. He's one of I've heard you describe Tom as one of the preeminent atheists on YouTube right now. And
Thanks.
yeah, you might be considered actually a leader in the atheist movement, if you would call it a movement, and I think you could. And so, yeah, you're doing pretty good there. But and I appreciate you having me on your show about a week and a half ago. But I want to follow up by just talking to you a little bit about who you are and how you developed your philosophy. I mean, talk a little bit about your background, where you're from, and your education and that.
Was born in Dallas, Texas. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Mhm.
I didn't try to get a degree because I was a waste of money, so I just audited classes. So it's cheaper that way in
Sure.
philosophy mostly.
Yep. Okay, so then you're kind of a self-made philosopher. What attracted you to philosophy? What is it about? I mean, I've heard it said that philosophy, people who major in philosophy often go on to become CEOs of major corporations, because you develop an ability to think. It's an organized means of thinking and developing a strong cognitive ability to view things in a very broad way.
Mostly philosophers end up living in boxes because it doesn't pay very well. It's not really.
Well, that's why they go work for CEO and become CEOs.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess unless you're unless you're an academic, I suppose, and those are tough gigs to come by.
Yes, there are very few of those positions available to go
Yes.
around. Not a.
Indeed. And so, if you don't mind my asking, I mean, how long have you been, what made you decide to do the YouTube thing, and how long have you been doing it? Because I think you have like over 1 million followers. It's incredible.
1 million? I don't think so. I have 10,000.
Oh, okay. Now maybe I've got that wrong, but
But
that's huge. I mean, that's building. That's enormous.
yep. So I got into philosophy as a way to try to cure my major depression. I was diagnosed with major depression a long time ago, had it most of my life, and philosophy was one of the things I attempted to use as a way to try to solve that.
Did that work for you? I mean, did you? It did
No,
not.
no.
Okay. You obviously are, the main theme of your program is to ask your guests to prove the existence of God, to prove evidence of God. What brought you to that, and what brought you to atheism and naturalism?
I wrote an epistemology and a model of morality, and the best way to demonstrate their effectiveness is to test them against other epistemologies that are prevalent in the field of philosophy. And so religion has both of those things. Theistic religion and apologetics has both of those things. And so I could test my models of epistemology and morality against theists by them presenting their arguments and evidence, and me seeing if my epistemology, how it compares to theirs, and answering questions of knowledge. And so that's how I got into discussing the topics, was because I would bring up my epistemic way of gaining knowledge and assessing evidence, and use it to compare to the theist to see which sounds more reasonable to myself and other people.
Okay, and your conclusion was that to remove the theistic aspect of a study of logic and moral and ethical questions, it created a superior body of work, I suppose.
Yes, pretty much.
I've just to talk about, I mean, I've been doing talk radio off and on for probably the better part of 20 years in Boston, where I live and where I'm from, in small markets. And One of the things that I've done besides politics is I have discussed religion. I have interviewed religious people, but I've also interviewed a pretty long list of atheists, including Greg Epstein, who is now the atheist chaplain at Harvard. I don't know if you've heard of him.
I have talked with him via email.
Yeah, and he sent me a few people also over the years to interview. And I know this is completely anecdotal on my part, so I want to acknowledge that when I state this. But my experience with those interviews has usually been that once I get into a talk with them and once I scratch the surface a bit, they do believe in not God in the sense of like the word God, but that they do believe that there is a higher authority, that everything isn't explained by, kind of the scientific observation, that science doesn't exist in a vacuum. And because the other day you said that a majority of people today are atheists. So I wonder if that's, they may think they're atheists and call themselves atheists and live their life as atheists, but I wonder if that's really the case.
Majority of people in many countries, not in the world. It's not the total population is not majority atheist. It's just in certain countries.
Right, but
UK.
but my contention is that I'm not sure that if we really did a canvassing of them and we really got into a discussion with them of their philosophy, whether or not they ultimately would be atheists, even if they didn't, even besides whether they'd admitted they were atheists, because ultimately most people do seem to, it seems to be almost baked into the human experience, human psyche, that we do believe that there is some kind of a supernatural authority that is beyond comprehension, that is beyond our ability to perceive what we can perceive in the natural world.
Well, atheist just means you don't believe in a God. Doesn't mean you don't believe in anything. Like there are many spiritual atheists. That's a thing. But believing in a higher authority can mean lots of things that don't include God. So atheism just means you don't believe in God. You can still believe in spirits and ghosts and magic and miracles. All kinds of things can exist without a God. So there are definitely many atheists who believe in supernatural things, but just not God. And they're still genuinely atheists. Like genuinely atheist just means not God.
Okay, how would you describe your belief?
Naturalism, physicalism, materialism.
Do you believe in any of the spiritual elements you mentioned?
No.
So you think everything can be explained simply by, I've interviewed people. I don't know if this, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I've interviewed people involved with Ayn Rand's movement, the objectivist movement, and I've admired Ayn Rand. I've read her novels, but she was a hardcore atheist, and they believe that everything can be explained by the seven senses, and that anything beyond that, the ability of the human being to perceive, is something that they don't believe in. Would that describe your orientation in that way?
No, I'm not a fan of Atlas Shrugged. Not really. I'm not a
Right.
fan of the book, but I think there are six senses. I don't, maybe
I mean,
it's like
six.
thought.
I'm sorry.
It's like which one is the seventh sense?
Yeah, what am I
I'm
talking
lost
about?
here. But
The
yeah,
ESP, this extrasensory perception, but no,
yeah,
that's not what they're into.
yeah. So I would think that everything in the universe can probably be defined as physical stuff. I don't know about the senses. I don't really care about human senses and whether or not we can sense it. I mean, we obviously can't see things like neutrinos, but they're still there. So I don't really care about the human senses. I care about what can be described through novel testable predictions and interactions in reality, and that is mostly only confirmed to be things in science.
Okay. It makes me think that the early 19th century had several philosophers, including Feuerbach, who called themselves materialists, and they influenced Karl Marx. And Feuerbach, I think his famous slogan was "You are what you eat," and that he believed that everything can be explained through matter, even thought and communication. Ultimately, even if you can't see it, is explainable in physical matter. Is that something that what are your thoughts about that?
I really don't care about Karl Marx. I tend to look at more modern philosophers who are actually up to date on the current science and philosophy. Guys from back then really didn't know anything, so they're not really relevant or have any idea about reality in general. So Karl Marx is just not relevant today. Nothing he said is really important other than for political philosophy. Nothing like his
I
actual
understand.
philosophy
Well, I'm
doesn't
not
really.
really asking about Karl Marx. I'm asking about this materialist idea that emerged in the 19th century that held that everything can be explained by matter. Everything is even thought. Even like if you and I share a thought, or if you have a thought that is a response to my thought, that can be explained through matter. It's not something that's, we may not be able to see it, but it basically defines the universe.
Well, that came a long time before Marx did. That came from like Plato and the different schools of empiricists and rationalists. But yes, I tend to think that we need some way to differentiate our imagination from reality because all the things we imagine are usually not real. And the best way to do that is currently science. Science does, in fact, give us a way to differentiate are things real or imaginary. And so far, the only things that have been demonstrated to be real are physical, naturalist stuff.
Including thought, or
Yes,
imagination is not real.
it's
Um,
physical. It's physical. It is
so,
real.
okay, so it has to
Thoughts
have,
can literally be weighed.
all right, so it has to have a physical explanation. Laws can literally be weighed. Um,
Thoughts.
oh, thoughts. What about, well, that brings me to my next question, which is what about abstract principles and axioms like, well, I mean, you could look at it biblically, but we could probably look at it from a secular standpoint as well. The things that basically make up a civic society. These are not physical things. They are, I would think, or correct me if I'm wrong, but they are emerged from experience over millennia of human societies in terms of what works and what doesn't work, where every society, even the most primitive, develops a code of morality and ethics. Does that,
Uh,
how do you think that is derived from? Is that a material thing, or is that something
yep.
that,
It's a material thing. So all ideas and concepts in the mind are patterns that we experienced and built in the mind. And we call those abstract things. They're just concepts that are physical things in the mind to describe things we interact with in the world. But yeah, it's all physical.
well, if those are abstract things that we construct in the mind, then why do we decide, for example, that murder is wrong, or that various other basic functions of most societies? I mean, is that just is that a product of the mind? Is that like a false construction of the imagination, or is that something that can be described or found in terms of material?
Well, I was talking about abstract things in general. Abstract things like logic, math, concepts, all of those are just things made up in the human mind to describe reality.
Oh, I agree with
Um,
you about math. Math is an abstract expression of real things.
yes.
I mean, one and one is two. It ultimately describes two entities that you're putting together next to each other to make from one to two. So yeah, I mean, I get that. Certainly, we have in the soft sciences things that can basically reflect the physical world. But I'm talking about maybe more of a moral code. How do we determine, functions that make a society work? Is that something that exists in like hard nature, or is that something that emanates from the imagination? And if so, how do we know which is right?
Well, yeah, what makes a society work is purely based on evolution. So it has nothing to do with morality. I think that there is an objective morality. Right now, all of the evidence that we have just says it's evolutionary. Just there's no evidence that there is an objective morality. It's just a hypothesis. But I think there is such a thing because I think that the patterns in minds as they evolve and develop in the universe will all converge on very specific patterns. And so there's an emergent phenomenon of this thing called morality that is a result of some fundamental nature in the universe that causes minds and consciousnesses to develop with this particular moral pattern. So I think there's an objective morality. There's no proof of this. It's just a hypothesis. All the evidence indicates it's just evolutionary physical stuff right now.
Mhm.
But I think in the future we will discover that this pattern is consistent across the universe. But yeah, it's still all just physical stuff.
Right, although, I mean, so we don't necessarily agree in terms of what that is. Maybe, because I would probably agree with you that the human experience from the beginning, however it happened, whether it be Adam and Eve, or whether it be that we somehow sprung out of a warm pond, that we are developing consciousness and we are be able to discover and discern principles that do tend to dictate the better way to live, and whether those things come from a creator of the universe or they're just out there somehow eternally, and they just came out of who knows what, that they do exist, and that they are objective, and that they are outside of human manipulation, that they are something that we can discover, that are principles that are real. No?
Yeah. Yep. I would agree with that, that there are, yeah, it's just there are
Okay.
objective features of the reality that we can discover that are independent of our subjective experience. Sure.
Oh, okay, but we don't necessarily agree in terms of what those are.
Yeah. I don't think there's any reason to think there's any non-physical spiritual realm at all.
Well, we are talking about a non-physical realm when we talk about these principles, because they're ideas, they're not physical realms, right? I mean, a concept is not a physical realm. It is I mean, I understand that as we were saying, math is an abstract expression of a physical realm, but things like, moral codes are not. I mean, it's not, they're simply ideas that exist or not.
No, I would say that morality is a result of certain patterns in reality, in nature, that cause our brains to have these ideas. I don't think the ideas themselves are morality. So, I'm whatever morality is objectively, it's some pattern of things that exist in the universe which cause us to have these ideas. The ideas themselves aren't existing moral things.
Okay. Do you believe in the soul?
No.
So then how do you explain, I know I'm kind of using a cliche here, but how do you explain the Queen of Soul? I don't
About
know, Aretha Franklin I'm talking about here. I mean, anybody,
I
is it
believe in
just,
soul music. Soul music is a thing.
yeah, but what makes that what it is? I mean, it's like anybody can put oxygen in their throat and they can emit a sound, and that sound can be shaped, but there's something about, and I'm using her as just a metaphor, but there's something about what she does that transcends simply emitting notes in a coordinated way. I mean, it's not, is it, or is it just in a way similar to that there's something bigger than a thought being a synopsis in the brain. And I think we can agree that there's not yet enough known about the brain by science. So, who knows? But I mean, how do you explain Aretha Franklin?
Um, Physics, air pressure,
And
density,
then why
evolution.
aren't there more people that can do this? I mean, what is it about? There's something that she's capturing that seems to, I mean, physics explains the mechanics of it, but, and air pressure and all that other stuff. But I mean, I would suggest that there is something that has to do with the soul that separates that she's able to tap into. And I think the same thing could be said for people in various performing arts or in other, I mean, there's something that, Picasso tapped into, or Rembrandt, or, that was not just putting pieces of colorful water on a canvas. I mean, what is it that made that what it was? I mean, or are we all just able to do that?
Well, it's usually just the pattern being something that is consistent with the cultural values of the time, which makes it popular. Like, I mean, you can say NFTs are popular now, but I think they're pretty garbage. So art and music are popular if the art and music is has some kind of pleasant pattern to it that is stimulated by evolutionary processes. So you need to have, that's why music has those very specific time frames and patterns of notes, because those are the ones that are pleasing to us, which has everything to do with evolution, because it's related to how we adopted sounds when we evolved. And so the patterns in music and why we find some pleasant and others not is due to evolution and cultural norms. It hasn't had, there's no like objective music measure of good music.
But I think that you need to differentiate between, for example, Aretha Franklin and a lounge singer, or maybe a little league coach and Carl Yastrzemski. Or you know what I mean? It's like they're the same person, maybe they have the same skills, they're dealing with the same set of cultural circumstances. But what is it that one of them is capturing? Or is it just a matter of marketing, or is it there's something bigger going on? I mean, is there something bigger going on with Mozart than with like a high school piano teacher? They're dealing with the same piano, they're dealing with the same set of notes. What is it that makes something what it is in that case? I mean, it goes beyond just, I mean, the explanation of physics or cultural, atmosphere, I would think.
I'm not sure what exactly you're describing here. Mozart
I'm
had
describing soul.
yeah, again, so I'm still not sure what you're describing. Mozart had most likely autism, and so people with autism have an ability and aptitude for finding patterns in things. And so the fact that people with autism are very, very good at finding patterns and creating things like Mozart symphonies and whatever is pretty common. That's why there are many people with autism in very high levels of power and arts and any kind of field like that, because they're very good at creating patterns that other people don't normally see. And so
Okay.
that's true of any field. There's nothing special there. It's just they find really interesting patterns that
Well, I mean,
match
there are
on.
a lot of people who are autistic, and yes, I would think autism might have been, served as a benefit, but it doesn't get to what the accomplishment there. I mean, that's in my opinion. I mean, otherwise we'd have millions of Mozarts,
We
because
do.
a lot of people have autism.
We do
What
have
was
millions of Mozarts.
No, I disagree. There was only one Mozart, and he did something very unique. And the same thing with other artists who were able to do something that stood out. And I would argue that something is soul. I want to ask you also about, we talked about evolution. You mentioned that after we went back and forth a bit, that you believed that man evolved from the ape. Is that right? Or did I have that
Yep.
wrong?
Yep.
All
We
right.
are apes. We literally are apes.
Okay, so that brings me, because I wasn't swift enough. Maybe I'm getting old here, but I didn't follow that up. So I'm really happy to have you here so I can now follow this up, because I've had a chance to think about it. If we are, if you take this theory of evolution, and that we evolved from apes, do you believe that this happened simultaneously, like in a one gigantic leap, where boom, all of a sudden out emerged Homo sapien? Or do you believe, and I would think this would be more consistent with the Darwinian idea and the modern evolutionary idea and science, if this is true, that we are at different levels of evolution? Like, for example, groups of people in one region might either be more or less evolved than people in another region. Because after all, evolution is the theory of breeding, and people might have better breeding or better, what Darwin called random selection in one area as opposed to another. So was it simultaneous, or are we at different levels of evolution?
Well, there aren't like higher or lower levels, but we are definitely at different amounts of genetic diversity. That is definitely a thing. And so some groups have longer legs and shorter legs and bigger muscles and shorter muscles, and some have an aptitude for more intellectual things and some have an aptitude for more physical things. There's different groups have different amounts or changes of genetic diversity, which give them greater or lesser aptitudes in many different things. There are some groups who can breathe underwater for several hours or hold their breath underwater for several hours, where others can't. Some have greater bone density. There's all kinds of different groups of humans with different genetic um, evolutionary traits that other groups don't have.
Do you think that transcends to intellectual development?
Yes, that is definitely going to be the case. Your brain is also a result of genes, and so yes, there is a selection process for intelligence and intellectual factors. So there are going to be differences in groups between intellectual things as a result of genes. Yes.
So you believe that one group could be smarter than another group due to evolution?
Necessarily, it's going to be the case that just like if you take any two people and ask which is smarter, one is going to be smarter than the other. If you take any two groups of people and ask which is smarter, one is going to be smarter than the other. It's just how reality works. Reality is not perfectly fair. It doesn't make everyone exactly the same intelligence.
No, it doesn't. But I have to say that I really reject this idea that one group has more intellectual capacity than another. And I would point to in that, and maybe this is an old-fashioned example, but Darwin's partner in evolution back then was William Wallace, who kind of has dropped out of sight because Darwin and Wallace had a falling out. But Wallace did an experiment where he brought a Jivaro tribesman from Indonesia, a young man, I think he was like a child actually, to Great Britain, where he was brought up by a British family, and he ended up attending Cambridge University, and he became fully intellectually the equal of any British, in fact, probably more intellectual than the average British citizen at the time. And yet he came from this tribe that one might think is less intelligent, maybe less evolved. And his claim was that this proved that this is not the case, that anyone has a level of intelligence that's better or worse, but as individuals, based upon their environment, based upon their education, it's not a genetic thing. It's not something that they're inherently at a level of evolution. And I think that this goes to the fact that whether, look, if we can accept the theory of evolution, then we would have to say that this happened spontaneously, that man emerged from the ape equally. And then, of course, on a religious standpoint, it gets into the principle that all men are created equal, which is what Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, and which he derived from the book of Genesis, which said that men and women are created in the image of God, and thus we are equal, not in terms of skill, not in terms of aptitudes, which are unique, or circumstance, but we are equal as in terms of literally, in terms of we're born equal, we die equal, we have an equal soul. So, in a way, I mean, it's either we're equal, which is the principle of the Declaration of Independence, or we're at different rungs of an evolutionary chain. Some are more equal than others. In other words, we're not equal in that sense.
Yeah, I don't think anybody thinks we're equal. That's not a thing. Down syndrome is a thing. We know for a fact that genes do affect your intelligence, and we know for a fact that some groups typically have higher IQs or higher intelligences than others. The fact that the average is pretty close to the same, it's not like a huge difference. It's because of evolution. We all have like the same general height. We all have two lungs. We all have a heart. Like the average is about the same, but there are differences, and some are generally higher than others. That's why Ashkenazi Jews have a disproportionate number of Nobel Prizes. It's not like a hard thing. Pretty much everybody in biology accepts this. It's just like the difference is not that big from a genetic standpoint. Most of the difference comes from a sociological standpoint. But yes, there are definitely genetic differences in intelligence. We know that for a fact.
I'm not sure we do know that as a fact. I don't think that Ashkenazic Jews are more intelligent. I think it has to do with the culture of Judaism and its emphasis on family and education and its heritage. It's not because people were born that way. I mean, you could have a child who was born in an Ashkenazi family who's brought up in another culture. They would not have that. I mean, this is not something that I think there's a consensus on. I don't think that one can say that someone, I mean, I don't know about you, but I mean, and maybe again, I'm getting anecdotal here, but I can think of some people, I don't know, I'm not naming names here in case anyone's watching, but they were born of very intelligent people, top people, in this country, and they're about as dumb as a rutabaga, okay? I mean, the genes weren't passed down to them.
That's not how genes work. So genes don't mean that if your parents are smart, you are necessarily smart. That's not how genes work. There's this thing called Down syndrome, where if you have a genetic defect, you don't have very intelligence, and Asperger's or autism, where you get lots of intelligence. We know for a fact genes affect intelligence. We know that these are heritable diseases that come from your parents, and doesn't, again, you don't get everything from, like, necessarily, if both your parents are brown hair, that doesn't mean you're gonna have brown hair, or if both your parents are blonde, doesn't mean you're gonna be blonde. You don't 100% get all the traits of your parents, because your genes are a little more complicated than that, and there's random mutation involved. But we know for a fact intelligence is heritable. We know for a fact that it is genetic. We can prove this. This has been proven in the lab many times, because we know that the average IQ or intelligence of kids is higher if your parents' IQ is higher, and it's lower if your parents' IQ is lower. This is something that has been proven without a doubt. We know for a fact intelligence is definitely heritable and definitely genetic, and it does change based on those factors.
I think that it's been argued that somebody might be more intelligent if their parents are intelligent, because they are exposed as very young children to a more intelligent atmosphere. They hear a more sophisticated language and exchange, and so that part of their mind develops more than somebody who doesn't. But it's not, I don't think that there's an agreement. I don't think that there's a consensus about whether or not this is hereditary or whether it's biological. And I think
There's definitely a consensus. They've done twin studies and adoption studies where kids who had more or less intelligent parents were adopted by other parents who are either more or less intelligent, and mostly the effect is genetic. It doesn't change based on your society. Your intellect level is not affected by that. It is affected by malnutrition. Like, if you have lower malnutrition, you have a lower intelligence. But overall, your genes have a profound effect on your intellectual level. And they have done many twin studies where twins were, one was raised by their parents and one was adopted by somebody else, or mixed up at birth, or
right.
whatever. And
No,
they
I've
can
heard
show
about
that the
that.
intellectual level is the same on both, because of their genes, even though they had vastly different sociological levels. We know for a fact it is definitely
No,
affected by genes.
I've heard about the twin studies. I mean, in fact, scientist Yosef Mengele did a lot of those studies. But I would only note that all that proves is that twins who both were in this shared an embryo, and they shared a mother. I mean, of course they're going to be similar. That doesn't. I mean, to me, that's like. I mean, I've heard this discussed from different sides. It's obviously they're going to share such closeness, whether or not they're brought up together, because they literally are of the same DNA. I mean, they come from the same womb. I mean, they come from the same, embryo. But look, maybe I'm bringing up here more of a philosophical point. And by the way, a Down syndrome person, as you mentioned, I mean, not that autism is equivalent, but they can have a very highly developed part of their mind. I mean, I seem to recall, it was 60 Minutes did a thing on this, where they had this young Down syndrome kid playing this incredible, piece of a piano concerto, or somebody who is, like somebody who's blind, or they're missing a facility. They can have a more developed facility in another area because they're compensating. I mean, Stevie Wonder comes to mind, or Ray Charles. So I don't know if that, I'm not sure that's so cut and dried. But philosophically speaking, I mean, the principle that the United States was founded on, and that does come from the Bible, is that all men and women, well, not women, eventually women, but all human beings are created equal. I mean, obviously we had to change and evolve
Except the
further
slaves.
politically, but excuse me?
Except the slaves.
Well, of course, but that's why we had a civil war, and we had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And we evolved, but at the time, it was the first time that there was this statement that was consistent with the Bible, that at least we understood that all men are created equal as an aspiration that would eventually become true. And it was completely different than societies at the time, where people were just subjects to a royal family which claimed to have divine rights, and they would give privileges to people rather than rights. So, the American conception there, politically and philosophically, I think was an acknowledgement of the biblical idea more so than any society at that point. And that, we've evolved ever since in the political sense, not in the biological sense.
Um, so a couple things there. One, it's not founded on Christianity. Two, all of the moral values in Christianity came from pre-existing religions, so nothing's unique to Christianity or Judaism or any of the Abrahamic religions. Three, most of morality comes from human nature and evolution. In that case, four, America isn't founded on Christianity or any of those. There's many different books that expound on the myth of the Christian foundation of the country. It's not most of them. Like Thomas Paine was an atheist. He's one of the founding fathers. Like many of them were just secular values. The whole point was a separation between church and state, a separation between the God idea and just innate human rights. So a lot of those things I would definitely disagree with from a historical standpoint. I think that mostly they're just human values that pre-exist any religious beliefs at all.
Oh, I agree with that. I mean, it's not that Christianity or Judaism created those things. They simply discovered those things early on, and the result was that they moved civilization forward, whereas those things had not been understood. I mean, Frederick Engels talks about humanity being involved with primitive socialism. So you didn't have this idea that man and women were different and that we were images of God. The idea was to move toward a collective mind, what Professor Julian Jaynes called a unicameral mind, which was probably described the mind and the person in those times. So, early Judaism was the first step toward understanding this concept. They didn't invent it. God invented it, according to Judaic understanding, although we don't try to prove there is a God, we believe in God. But we understood and we were able to distill it. And this was the principle that is one of the founding philosophies of the United States. And it does, you have to look at history. It goes back to that biblical understanding. It's not uniquely, in a denominational sense.
Well, it goes back further than that. Like the innateness of human value predates Judaism by several thousand years in Hinduism and Jainism. So it comes from before Judaism.
Well, I mean, I don't know if those are before Judaism. I mean, they probably are around the same time. I mean, I don't know where you get your chronology on that, but and Jainism, I don't think is as old. But Hinduism in that time was more involved with paganism and multiple beliefs in gods.
Yes, but they're the innate human value thing, like the golden rule comes from Hinduism. Hinduism predates Christianity and Judaism, which are predated by Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism was the first monotheism, so it predated Judaism, and it was around about at the same time as Hinduism originated and Buddhism. I think it's Hinduism and Buddhism, not Jainism.
Okay.
I think Jainism.
I don't know.
I think Jainism is also one of the really old ones. I think it's also 6,000. But so those all predate Judaism.
I'm not sure they do, but we could. I don't know if either of us could really point to that. I mean, and there are different opinions. I think that Judaism is the first religion, religion in the West, in Western civilization, to identify this principle of one God versus multiple earthly man-made gods, which was
well, I understand Zoroastrianism to be the first monotheism.
I don't understand that. And Zoroastrianism back then wasn't monotheistic. They had Aurora Zor, they had like a fire god and a like a kind of an ice god, and that they were fighting each other. I mean, it was a different thing. Eventually, I think it did become more monotheistic. In fact, most religions now are monotheistic, including Hinduism. But I think that in the early stages, it was Judaism, the children of Israel, that were the first to have this development of there being one God that was not in the world, that was not like a God that could be created by the hand of man, and that man could therefore not manipulate the moral and ethical code. It was the idea that there was an objective moral and ethical code that came outside of the ability of man to create it. It wasn't invented. Whereas the early religions, and this is what the Torah warns us about, were involved in idol worship, which was a man-made god, that, you know, the state would put the gods, you know, would speak for the god, and then they say, throw your baby in the belly of this burning, you know, furnace, and you'll be saved, you know, that kind of thing. Judaism said, no, you can't, man doesn't invent these gods. Man, you know, can, you know, there's a greater code of that's beyond the ability of man to understand that you know, because we're living in the secular world, we're living in the natural world, and that this is a supernatural concept. That, I think, was first identified by Judaism. And it's not because it's, I don't mean this in a chauvinistic sense, it's a God for all man, but it was really first identified in Western civilization by Judaism.
Well, I
And
mean,
Christianity then advanced it for the whole world, I believe.
well, the morality independent of humans also pre-existed to Judaism. Like Hinduism and Buddhism both had those, the Dharma field thing. But again, I don't think anything was unique in Judaism. Nothing from the Abrahamic religions was unique. It was all predated by other religions. It
Okay,
just happened to be the most successful.
I think we just have to disagree. And no, Judaism didn't invent this idea. They identified it, and thus they embraced it, and they had all the struggles with the embrace and all of the temptations of the idol worshiping that was going on around them, and the earthly tendency to want to create a utopia on earth by the hand of man, which seems to be what happens oftentimes when you take away the belief in God.
Well, that literally a thing it says in the Bible that Jesus will do that. The Messiah will do that in both Judaism and Christianity, that he will come down with a sword and there'll be peace on earth. It literally just, it says that. So all gods are man-made, and they all have the same thing of wanting to try to create a heaven on earth by their own religious tenets. That's kind of a theme.
But
in
it's
all
not
religions.
supposed to be created, you know, look, it's not supposed to be created by the hand of man. We are waiting for a divine event to do that. And in the case of Judaism, the model is that we have a covenant with God that was basically devised at Sinai. The model for Christianity is that they have a personal relationship with God through Jesus as being the intercessor, but it's not the man, it's not the Christian or the Jew that is supposed to implement this utopia on earth. That's where you have a rejection of God. Now, that doesn't mean that this earthly idea of creating utopias doesn't seep into religions. I think it seeps a little bit more, frankly, into Islam than it does into Judaism and Christianity, because Islam has a militant side where the man is commanded to physically conquer the world and make the world submit. Whereas, again, with Christianity, it's a personal relationship. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that, more in the case of Christianity, they haven't gone out and conquered people and they haven't tried to force people. But when they do that, it's sort of runs at variance with the basic belief and the doctrine. It's an exception. It's a moving away from this idea, and it's moving toward a more man-made understanding, which is that man can create a perfected world on earth through force and through utopian, you know, because he's superior, because he's intellectually, you have a clique of people who believe that they're intellectually superior and that they have some kind of a right to do this in order to make a better world. That's something that's a rejection of the God principle.
Well, I think it's interesting that you think the God principle is that we should sit around and wait for someone else to solve our problems. I think that it's a better idea to like try to actually do it ourselves and not wait for non-human things to come from space and solve our problems, essentially. But I don't.
Well, who decides how to do that then, Tom? I mean, you know, yes, I think we can make a better world by, you know, trying to understand these greater principles and not by using force. So if you're going to tell me that man should create the better world, what right do you have to do that if your vision of the better world isn't shared by me?
Well, we can establish what a better world is independent of your opinion. Like your opinion doesn't matter. Whether or not you agree doesn't really matter. We can pretty much agree that humans and consciousness has value, and hurting them without need is bad, and so we should do that as least as possible. And so the perfect world is one where it's impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to, and we can build that world. And then if you want to
Okay.
have different rules for your world than mine, that's fine. Just no one has to be a part of your world or your house or whatever.
No, look at, I mean, I actually, I mean, I find when you say that, I mean, I actually agree with that principle, but only in the sense that I come at it from the understanding that given the fact that the human being is not God, and we can't know all of the truths of the universe, we're imperfect beings, we're images of God. And as such, we don't have the right to decide what our neighbors should do. I mean, we have a right to set up governments so that we can be free to live our life and control our own destiny, but within a structure by which we don't hurt our neighbors. So I don't know. I mean, I think we're in agreement, but maybe with a little bit of a different orientation on that.
Sort of. So I would say that we humans can create the best of all possible worlds, which is one where it's impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to. So you can have your house or your country, whatever, and set it up with whatever rules you think is appropriate. And then other people can set up their house with whatever rules they think is appropriate. And people can choose to be a part of whatever community they think is the one they like. And as long as they're able to like actually move there, will like pay for their trips or whatever,
Yeah.
then that's fine. So I think that we can create that world where it's literally impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to. I think that's a thing humans will be able to accomplish in future.
I actually agree with that. I mean, I don't think that contradicts belief in God, but I agree with that. And I think that, however, we set up governments so that it can arbitrate conflict, which comes up every so often between conflicting interests, right? I mean, that's fine too. Nobody's going to have absolute, no one's going to be like their own feudal prince and they can just do anything. You have to live in a community, and sometimes you have to not get certain things because it conflicts with the rights of other people. So yeah, I mean, that sounds very much like, in the ballpark of like what Ayn Rand talked about. This is very objectivist, and I actually kind of agree with that, although I do think that there is a spiritual component to it. It's not just simply a matter of me being a free person and you being a free person.
Sure. But yeah, I think we can do this without any God intervention. We can just do it as humans. That would be probably the disagreement.
No, I don't claim that I know that God's going to intervene. That's something that only God knows. I think it's possible, but I don't, to me, to claim that God's intervening, that gets into a paganistic thing because we don't know this. In a way, I don't know if I mentioned it last time, but my understanding, and again, I'm not a rabbi, I'm not a Jewish expert, but Judaism tells me that we can't prove that there's a God, but we believe in God. We declare that there's a God because we believe that man is more than just a bag of bones, and that there is some greater purpose. But we don't come around and speak for God. We're not saying, well, we have to, we may want to talk about it in our own communities, but we're not using force to do that. That's something that in a way is anathema to I think to certainly the Jewish ideal, not necessarily anathema to other religions.
Cool.
So anyhow.
Oh, someone in my chat asked, who is the person in the poster in your background?
Oh, that's a painting of Trump.
Ah, got it. kind of from the lighting looks like a composer from the 1800s kind of a thing.
Well, he's wearing kind of like a neckwear that might be like an 18th century poster. No, I'm a huge admirer of Trump. I mean, I think that he's like in a way, the anti-authoritarian figure, which is why I admire him. But what are some of
I,
your,
I would disagree. I think he's more authoritarian than most, but
oh, I don't think so at all. I mean, thank goodness he wasn't. I mean, if we had had anyone else president during this horrible pandemic, I mean, we would have, I remember people like de Blasio and Cuomo, they were calling for martial law. They were calling for the army to come out. Trump was very conservative in that. He basically allowed the states to handle their own affairs with federal aid and backup. But, he governed very conservatively. He wasn't, he didn't resort to, the typical authoritarian approach, except in very rare situations. It was, so I don't think there's any evidence that was in any way authoritarian at all. Quite the opposite. He wanted to return power to the people, at least in principle.
well, I would say his attempts to overthrow the election would be a pretty good authoritarian example of changing policies without going through Congress, and many of the different policies he tries to enact were pretty authoritarian. But
Well, look, I mean,
slightly different topic.
let me just say about this, Tom, because I'm running this show live on YouTube, and this is a verboten topic on YouTube, so I don't want to go too far into it, other than to say, take an objective look at that situation and what happened on that day. We
Well,
have,
I wasn't talking about January 6th there. I was talking more about his.
I'm talking about November 3rd, the
Oh, gotcha.
election.
Gotcha.
Take let's not go there, because again, I'm running live on YouTube. I don't want to lose my station. We are now banned from talking about that since this election. So let's suffice to say that people may want to put aside some of their ideology and take a quiet look at that situation and come up to your own conclusions. And I'll just suffice to say that from election day till today, polls indicate that an average of 60% of Republicans believe that there was something that wasn't exactly kosher that happened on that election day. And I would suggest the number is probably a lot higher than that, but people are afraid to say it because of the fact that, as I just mentioned, you could get banned and worse. So I mean, if you want to talk about that, and if your guests want to talk about that, I am more than happy to get into the evidence that I would present on that one, but we'll have to do it on Rumble only, not on YouTube, because YouTube is no longer free in terms of expression. Anything else, Tom?
No, that's fine. Do you have any other questions?
No, I mean, I think that we've covered it. I mean, I kind of have a better understanding of where you're coming. I don't really want to debate it. As I said, that as a Jew, I don't believe that we can prove God. In fact, it's a contradiction in terms to say we can, because God is supernatural and we live in the natural world. So we can't prove a supernatural principle. We can believe in a supernatural principle, and we can believe that there is a greater function to the universe than merely matter, and that there is something more significant to our lives than simply moving around and breeding and being a bag of bones. Is there anything, Tom, why don't you take this opportunity to talk about your program, your website, where people can go to watch you?
Sure. So I run a YouTube channel, youtube.com/tjump, where I host debates and conversations, usually on philosophy, existence of God, morality, that kind of stuff. My goal is to start an atheist church, a church without a God, essentially. And our goal is to move towards that world I described, one where it's impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to. And the way to do that, we're going to try and decrease the cost of living for as many people as possible by buying an apartment building. And since it's going to be a church, it's going to be tax exempt, so we can lower the cost of rent as much as possible for the tenants, and expanding out on companies in that kind of a method where we do it the right moral way to do it. And so that would be the goal of the atheist church, based on my model of morality, to make a world where it's impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to. And that is what I'm currently working on.
Good. No, I think that's laudable. I mean, maybe we could talk about that in the future, but no, I think that's quite interesting. Keep me posted on it.
Sure, will do.
All right. All right, Tom Jump, thanks so much for joining me today. Great talk. I really appreciate it. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks. I'll talk to you later.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.